Hello to anybody who is streaming in and to people from the future who are watching this on YouTube. My name is Nicole Brinkley. I am the manager of Oblong Books in Rhinebeck, New York. And before I introduce our wonderful author, I'm just going to remind you all of a couple things, do some little housekeeping. One, we are an independent bookstore. We ship books. We get to put on events because you buy books. So please buy books. If you already own Floating Hotel, buy a second one. It makes a great gift. Two, if you like events like this, we do more virtual events. I have one coming up next month with John Wiswell, who wrote Someone You Can Build a Nest In, which is another queer piece of speculative fiction and one of my favorite books I've read this year. It's terrific. If you are interested, head to oblongbooks.com/event, and you can sign up for that now. I think that's all my housekeeping. More events, buy books. Sounds pretty straightforward. And now I'm going to jump straight into today's event. So I am deeply pleased to have zooming in from over the pond in the UK, Grace Curtis for Floating Hotel. Grace is also the author of The Space Western Frontier, which takes place in the same universe as Floating Hotel, but you do not have to read both. They both work as standalones. And I am so excited to talk to Grace today. I just finished this book the other day, and it's fantastic. Hi, Grace.
Hi. Stop it, you.
If Grace, for some reason, from being across the pond, gets disconnected at any point or there's lag, we're just going to ride it out. That's how the internet works. How are you doing today, Grace?
I'm okay. It's 11:02 p.m. I've got a nice stiff glass of water and I'm wearing my PJs from the bottom down. So, but I'm feeling a second wind come over me already.
I've got like the professional shirt up top and pajama pants on the bottom. So
Yeah,
we are
amen. That's how it's
we're
done.
we're twins that way. So, Floating Hotel, for those of you who might not know, is a cozy spaceship mystery. It is set on the Grand, is it Abiona? Is that how you would
Albiona,
pronounce
yeah.
that?
Yeah.
The Grand Abiona Hotel. And I'm going to have Grace talk a little bit more about this, but you meet all of the different crew members and some of the guests in what seem to be these kind of like interconnected, not short stories, and it's not head hopping in the way that traditional fantasy does, where you go back and forth between different characters. Um, but you get this underlying narrative as you shift through all of the characters. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the format of this wonderful cozy spaceship mystery?
Yeah, ab absolutely. I mean, it's um an ensemble piece, I guess. There is no
Yes.
particular one character. And I owe a huge amount. If you're reading this and you like the way if you and you like the way the story is told, um, I would really recommend reading another book by a British author to whom I cannot compare, Girl, Woman, Other, which won the Pulitzer, not the Pulitzer, pardon me, the Booker, a couple of years ago, and does a very similar thing to kind of explore different roles of like women and non-binary people in the history of the UK. And I read that, I thought it was just fantastic. And so when I had this idea, um, I immediately knew that that kind of person-to-person format was the perfect way to tell that story. And because I wanted it to be, because my first one is kind of a road trip novel, it's quite expansive. You're sort of starting afresh almost every chapter, or at least it feels that way. This one, I wanted to have this sense almost of a bunch of human beings really crunched together and their lives overlapping, and everyone having kind of their own internal stories, but things connecting. And yeah, so I kind of very naturally gravitated towards that format, and it ended up proving to be a lot of fun in the writing process.
My coworker Anna, who also loves queer sci-fi, loved Girl, Woman, Other, and is going to be hyped when I tell her that tomorrow.
Yeah, I owe everything to Made in Every Genuinely, it was a absolutely it was a massive touchstone.
That is an Oblong staff pick and a Grace Curtis pick, so go pick up a copy.
Yes.
Now, Okay, so this is an ensemble cast, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the ensemble cast in a moment. I think there is a main character, and I think the main character is the Grand Abiana Hotel. Uh, she's everywhere. She does it all. There is a moment early on in the book where you're talking about the difference in having class versus having wealth and having money, and how even as the ship over time has gotten more cash strapped, it still has class. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Grand Abiona Hotel, where you kind of came up with the idea for a locked hotel mystery spaceship, and how you came up with her design?
Yeah. So why a hotel? I guess it felt to me immediately connected to sort of an emotional tenor I was trying to th so we have this idea of like a hotel at the turn of the century. Grand Budapest Hotel has obviously been cited as a very obvious inspiration for the stories. It's like this kind of aging, faded, worn out, and yet somehow still having an element of former glory. And I think there's something about that kind of 1920s, 30s between the war aesthetic that evokes a very particular feeling. Another big touchstone for this book for me was Casablanca. It's this sense of being almost suspended in a bubble, and again, use the spaceship, very literally suspended in a certain moment in time and in a certain feeling of perhaps illusional safety. And that was really what I wanted to evoke, because this for me is a book about um how to put it, it's a book about transience, right? And it's a book about things that can't last. And so that seemed to me like the perfect way to encapsulate that. Another big touchstone, obviously, like there's an Agatha Christie-ness to it. And someone, I wish I could remember who it was, but someone recently compared the book to one of my favorite movies, definitely my favorite Hitchcock, which is The Lady Vanishes, which is a fantastic, it's kind of in the vein of the Orient Express. It's about a woman who is traveling through Europe, kind of on the brink of war, on a train. She's kind of on a jolly, this young woman, and makes friends with an old lady. Sits next to her. They're like, going between countries. Um, and she goes to sleep and she wakes up and the old lady's gone, and no one will tell her. Everyone basically is like, I never saw that lady. I don't know. So it's like her kind of trying to unravel this mystery in this locked room. So yeah, for me, and so it was kind of creating those moods of like sort of nostalgia and wistfulness, but also this sort of sinister undertone and this sense of like looming danger that all those kind of Agatha Christie type settings bring up. And also, I just thought it was fun. I thought it was just a sort of perfect way to introduce organically sort of a big, interesting ensemble cast, which is what I really wanted to do with this book, and have an excuse for them all to know each other and be on top of each other and in each other's lives, even if they aren't necessarily people that they would have chosen as their own volition, because that's what the service industry is like.
Truly, anybody who's worked service or retail, you get buddy buddy with people really fast who you might not have expected to otherwise.
Hmm.
And what about her design? Because she is supposed to kind of be in this very modern, kind of high-tech future, this kind of analog, very classic throwback. Like I got a lot of like Gilded Age energy off of her.
Hmm.
Um, tell, is that part of the inspiration? Where did you pull from?
Well, I think it's funny because I've had that question a couple times of like
Mhm.
Abiona as character, and the sort of the subtext for me with all of this is that is Nina, that is the previous manager, and everything
Yes.
you see in the design is an
Mhm.
extension of her. And so thinking that obviously there's a level of my taste, right? I love Art Deco, I love analog. So I'm sort of just like pouring in a bunch of things that I personally would find seductive, but also the idea of like, okay, this is designed to be seductive. It's designed to feel warm and comforting and special. So I was sort of thinking of my own taste, but I was also thinking on a high level of like, okay, how would a cunning person create a space that felt safe and create a space that felt like cozy and unassuming? So it's sort of drawing into sort of thinking about it on multiple levels, which is what I had to do all the time with this book, was always thinking about things from like multiple perspectives, multiple levels. Things are often like the timelines are overlapping.
Mhm.
So yeah, so that's kind of where my head was at when I was coming up with it. But it was mostly just from a place of like wistfulness initially.
Yeah, I love the role that Nina plays in the book because you only see her on page, like I think in the first few pages, and then she's just quite literally the ghost in the machine, right? Like
Hmm.
she's the voice that goes off when like the emergencies happen,
Yes.
the hidden I'm not going to spoil anything, but as the mysteries unfold, we learn a little bit more about Nina and what Nina was up to.
She's
Um,
omnipresent. Yes.
yes, perpetually there. Um, So we have a lot of people that we meet in this series of hijinks, mysteries, shenanigans that unfold. We could argue that out of all of the characters we meet, the main character, I guess, would technically, if we had to pick one, be Carl. But can you tell us a little bit about some of the staff members and guests that we meet, and maybe which ones were your favorites to write?
Yeah, I would say Carl is definitely the heart of the novel. And the story doesn't function if you don't like him. So, if any, he definitely takes the crown as being the most important character because I think he's someone who all the other characters are kind of turning to repeatedly, and his emotional journey is what's kind of threading together. Like that is the thread that runs through everything. It's where Carl has come to in his life and what his life has been like till then. Um, Aside from that, let me think. So my personal favorite character probably Azad, um, the arsey old lecturer who's kind of burnt out and sick of life and is kind of being dragged reluctantly into a science fiction intrigue. I like writing grouchy women. It's an unending it's a source of constant pleasure for me. So yeah,
Also a
definitely
fave of mine. Like,
yeah.
oh, I'm being forced to solve puzzles against my will. I would rather
Yes.
be at the spa.
Exactly, literally. She would should have been at this bar, being forced to make friends against her will. So yeah, Azada's really sort of again super fond of her. I think Uwade, who's a concierge, not one of the more like zany characters, but I think another favorite of mine because she is practically sort of unassuming and kind in a practical way that I actually encountered a lot through working in places like hotels and bars. They're often sort of a person you would meet who is just kind of in a again like quietly makes time for everybody and like is like in a not in a calculating way. It's just very genuinely offering friendship and assistance. And so yeah, she's another favorite. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if I yeah, Carl would probably take the number one spot for me, but I have a big soft spot in my heart for all of them. It's even the ones who are less likable. I it still
You
am
have
fond of.
I, you have a few characters who there's the main plot and then there's several like subplots happening underneath, and some of them are
Mhm.
just like workplace hijinks, and some of them are like I'm in a Bond movie and nobody else knows that.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's fantastic. Um, so in my reading, I love fantasy, I love science fiction, and I love science fantasy. And one of the things I think is really interesting about Floating Hotel is I read a lot of cozy science fiction, right? And a lot of it is actually like science fantasy, where it
yeah.
kind of blurs that line of like, oh yeah, there's aliens who can do all this magic stuff. And one of the things I really liked about Floating Hotel is it's cozy sci-fi, but it's also hard sci-fi. It doesn't dabble in like there's magic, there's creatures who can do mysterious things. It's like, oh, there's humans and they've spread out across the galaxy, and now this hotel is kind of falling apart a little bit, and there's some spy stuff happening. So when you're writing something like this or writing generally, what guides you towards science fiction as a writer? Um, Being a fan of it, but also like what helps you stay in that realm of like hard science fiction?
It's a funny question, and I think one of the great privileges of doing this job is that I don't have to think too much about the labels.
Mhm,
If I was self-publishing or if I was doing more things more in the other vein, I would have to think about how to market myself and where
mhm.
my audience is and how we're going to categorize it and stuff like that. It never occurred to me that I was writing hard or cozy sci-fi at any point. I just wrote this, that was the story I wanted to tell, and I knew these were the feelings the feelings that were running through my mind at the time. That was what I was trying to get out. So hard and soft, I suspect are kind of imperfect metrics that we will maybe adjust a little bit because sometimes people discuss cozy and they're like, okay, this book is cozy, but it also seems to have themes. And I'm like, yeah, all the cozy literature has themes. It
Yeah.
sort of it doesn't mean that it's like frivolous.
I
Um,
I love the idea that it would be like, oh, well, a Miyazaki movie is cozy, but it definitely doesn't have themes. It's like, were you not what
no, you're not
cozy
paying
things have
attention.
themes all the time.
Yeah, well, I think that's the result of people reducing these books, and it happens to Miyazaki as well. People, been reduced to like an aesthetic, and
Yeah.
people aren't actually engaging with the story at all. And, Becky Chambers is sort of she's kind of the flagship cozy writer, but if you read her work, there are like deep existential things happening under the
Yeah.
surface, right? So, again, it's all made up, it's all
Mhm.
imaginary. But I would say the reason I'm drawn to science fiction in particular, and this is much more than compared to my first one, which was sort of a sort of Western with sci-fi trimmings. This is much more in the sci-fi realm. And I think again, thinking about this as being a book about like transience, uh, loneliness, community, how all those themes interact with like the emotional texture of outer space is something I found really interesting. The whole idea of just a huge intractable void that goes on and on and on forever, and we don't know what's in there. Um, that was just a sort of a contra and especially contrasting that with this like cute little bubble of a hotel we've made. That was something that I found just immediately on like a sensory level really compelling. And of course, it allows you to kind of when you're in, I think sci-fi writers sort of there's arbitrarily more constraints, but in a lot of ways, it's the most freedom you can have as a writer because you don't have to come up with the same internal logic of like a brand new fantasy world, right? And I know because
Mhm.
I'm writing a fantasy novel right now, it's really fucking hard. Um,
Yeah.
you actually have to do a lot less work because you have the sort of logic of every day, and then you can just
Mhm.
blow up whatever the hell is interesting to you. So for me as a writer, I find sci-fi, I think I was drawn to it almost mostly because of the freedom. And that's why I've kind of started my career in that world, and it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, in science fiction, you can take the laws and rules you already know and just scale them up to 100. Whereas in
Mhm.
fantasy, you're like, oh no, I have to make the rules.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So for me, as someone, it's funny because people are like, whoa, it's sci-fi, but it's character driven. Where I'm like, yeah, it makes loads of sense to have sci-fi be a character because it's like you're just kind of, it's like everyday life, but in a on a heightened stage.
Yeah.
And that's super fun for me as a writer and hopefully as a reader as well.
Were there any facts you learned about space while you were doing research for both Frontier and Floating Hotel that didn't make it into your books?
I think
No,
everything I learned, I think I
I'm gonna
write
put it
and then I
all
come up with
in.
something. Literally, I didn't compared to you asked me that question for the third one, you will get a much longer answer because I have been reading so many books about ancient Rome and no one wants to hear me talk about it. But yeah, for me it was everything I find out about space scares me. So I haven't looked into it too much.
I've been re-listening to one of my horror podcasts, and I think it was like 2 hours after I finished Floating Hotel, I got to one of their episodes that's just like
Mm,
space is scary, and I was like, yeah,
yeah,
that's why the idea of a
it's
hotel is comforting. I can't get stuck in
exactly.
space. There's a hotel there.
I mean, one
They'll
thing I
rescue
did
me.
enjoy, just because I wanted it to have, even though this is obviously not, again, hard science fiction, I wanted it to feel that to have kind of a sense of internal logic of how space travel
Mhm.
works. Okay, it takes them this amount of time to get from here to here, and while they're there, they don't have signal. So I did quite enjoy reading like different theories of how space travel could work, and how different writers and sort of scientists have tackled the problem. Um, but yeah, mostly like actual realistic visions of how space travel works. It's like, okay, so this is going to take 4,000 years, so we're going to just have to work on it. Like,
It's the scientific equivalent of writing fan fiction. It's like, well, we don't know how this is going to end up, and we're not going to be around to see it, so we're just
mhm,
going to take what we know now and make it up.
yeah.
So one of the really think like the things I really like about Floating Hotel, and that I've liked about a lot of the adult science fiction and fantasy I've been reading lately, is how queer normative of a world it is. Um, I come from a YA background, and also just because of the like shift in books that we've seen over the past 10 years, it kind of used to be that if you had any like queer characters on a page, you even if it was in a science fiction or fantasy world where labels might not make sense, like characters would go out of their way to be like, by the way, I am a lesbian. And it's like, how did you get that word in your
Yeah, and it
world,
has to like come
person?
up in conversation
Yeah,
in a sort of like weird way. Yeah.
you've managed to work it in there somehow.
Mm.
And one of the things I've really loved about the queer normative stories I've been reading is you have people of various sexualities and gender orientations who might not be using words that we are using in today's language because they come from the future where it's normal or they come from different worlds. Um, what does queer normative world building look like when you are working on it? Like, is it a thing that comes naturally to you, or when you sit down and write, is it a thing that you're like actively constructing
Oh
as
yeah,
you're
no,
drafting?
I don't think about it. For me, again, that's like a matter of just cutting out the chaff, cutting out conversations that I don't find interesting to write, cutting out
Yes.
exposition that I don't find interesting
Mhm.
to read, and getting to the good stuff for me. That is really what it's about. Like I'm not even really doing it uh as a mark of like progress. I know it's nicer for queer readers most of the time. But for me, I'm not even it's not about like making the world feel sort of nice or whatever. It's
Yeah.
just the story is more interesting when you cut to the good stuff. It's like, okay, we don't need to stand around and explain that we're gay. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do with all this romantic tension? Are we going to act on it? Are we going to not? What's my wife going to
Yeah.
say? Blah blah blah. Um, yeah, and also like sometimes feel, and I've seen, I don't engage with people who would be negative about this kind of thing. But even in the positive reviews, it's like, and it's so nice that you've been so diverse. That's so nice of you to go out of your way. Like I've been doing a favor to the people of the world. It's just like, have you never worked in a hotel? Have you never worked in a kitchen? Like that's just
Mhm.
what like I'm not sort of condescending to create a reality that is more diverse than it would actually be. Like, no, this is just what it's like when you work in the service industry. There are people of every walks of, and they are forced to get on. So yeah, again, for me, like it's a politically nice thing to have, but I think it's truer to life and it makes for a better story. And that's kind of ultimately my goal is to tell good stories. So yeah, it's natural.
I think like I think one of the things I also like about queer normative books is if we look at the size of your galley, it's so nice and readable. And I feel like we do see that a lot of the time where you'll see like there's an extra 100 pages just because authors were like, I got to explain all these sexualities and genders and how
Mm,
we got there. And it's like, no, we're along for the ride. We're buying in.
hmm
We've opted in. Let's
Yeah,
go.
trust the reader. Like let them.
Yeah.
Again, it's such a delicate balancing act, and with this story where it's like I feel like a lot with my writing, I'm often asking quite a lot of the reader. I'm throwing them into unfamiliar situations. I'm not giving them that kind of the analogies sometimes is if you've ever heard of the fanfiction My Immortal, which is this like infamously bad Harry Potter fanfiction that like went viral. But it begins with like a like main character's name, background, hair color, lip color, eye color, everything she's wearing, and it's just like and that's kind of the classic insecurity of like you have to have every little detail established before we can begin the story. Um, and again, I'm like, I think I'm trying in my development as a writer to learn to trust the reader more and respect them. And hopefully the respect is mutual.
Yeah, it's in finding that understanding of like you've picked up this book, you're opting into the ideas. I don't have to explain to you that the bad guy is bad. You're just going to see it as it
hmm
happens. Um,
Yeah, and
and
that's why I like writing in genre as well, right? Because that
yes.
when you're for example, Frontier has a murder mystery on a train, like it's a kind of emotional shorthand that you can
Mhm.
use to put people in a certain mindset, and then you're like, okay, so we all know what the vibe is, we all know what the situation is. Where do we go from here? And so again, it's a way of like locking eyes with the reader and sort of forming an understanding immediately,
Mhm.
and getting that context immediately, and then you can go off and do sort of fun and unexpected things once you're there.
I love it. Um, okay. So one of the running gags in Floating Hotel is the movie night. So, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, um, there is a character who finds old films and kind of coerces all of their coworkers and occasionally some guests into watching them as part of this ongoing movie night. And throughout the book, uh, they find illegal films because in this world, humans have expanded across the galaxy, but aliens have not been found, and are they don't exist. They definitely don't exist, because if they did exist, it would really mess up the hierarchy of consciousness that uh, the government has established. I want to ask you about the movies, but I also want to ask you about the government structure you've created. You have the emperor and his many clones, um, kind of disseminating information. Um, Government who's reinforcing it, but you also have a bunch of rebels. You have the lamplighter, who is our underlying mystery of the story is who is the lamplighter, who is a rebel writer, writing against how silly the emperor is.
Yeah, just
Um,
making fun of him, basically.
the same way every Brit I've ever met makes fun of the royal family, and
Yeah.
it's my favorite.
Mhm.
Um, So where did that kind of world building structure come from? Obviously, you knew you wanted a mystery on this cozy little spaceship in the vastness of space. But when did you start weaving in this like government rebellious writer, this really messed up clone emperor? Where did all of that come from? How early on did you know that you wanted those things involved?
Oh, I mean, right from the beginning, because the first thing I wrote of this book was the ending, and I knew that it was going to end with almost like the bubble becoming finally popped, and the forces of the crushing forces outside the hotel becoming too much for the inside of it to bear. So I knew from the beginning that there was going to have to be intrigue, there's going to have to be sinister things at play. And I also knew about that. And it was like, I knew who the lamplighter was, I knew what role they were going to play, and I knew how they were going to ultimately factor into the ending. And so well, now, once I had all that stuff established, I was able to have a huge amount of fun just working out the kinks and seeding it out. And and I also knew about the other subplot that relates to the ban on the aliens. So it was I sort of had the kind of difficult work done already, and that meant I could just kind of have fun. So with something like Shit Movie Club, we're just like, okay, this is I'm just going to be as silly as I possibly can be with this because I know how it feeds into the ultimate arc of where the story is going. So yeah, it was great amount. It was a great time. I actually sort of research when I was thinking about the political structure of the empire, I began reading more about the history of the British Empire, which is very badly taught in British schools. So I sort of went out of my way to read a bit, read up a bit more about that, and pretty quickly realized that I couldn't make it a one-to-one parallel because that would make the book too dark. I was like,
Yep.
yeah. I was like, oh, I can make it kind of like a really direct allegory for the British Empire. And I was like, oh, if I do that, this book is going to be too sad and too difficult because holy shit. Um, what a
You know,
wretched, shameful history we have in this nation. But
you
yeah,
got
that was
up to some
definitely.
stuff.
Um, so yeah, that was kind of another element that I had on my mind. But ultimately, it was kind of like me, almost like laying this what do you call it when the marble runs through the the sort of elaborate mousetrap.
I know what you're talking about. I can't remember the phrase for it. Somebody who remembers it, put it in the comments. The
Someone will be screaming it right
Is it
now.
the Rube Goldberg machine?
Rue Goldberg, yes, exactly. So
Yeah,
I knew where
I
I
got it.
wanted the marble to go, so I was able to have a wonderful time adding new bells and whistles to my Rue Goldberg machine as I went.
The other thing I wanted to ask about the movie night is, um, so I'm a big fan of Dimension 20, which is for those of you who don't know, Grace, you might not know, is a live action D&D table role play. And they did a season set in the universe of Starstruck Odyssey, which was a sci-fi comic series, much more science fantasy than Floating Hotel is. But if you liked this, go watch that series. It's great. They have an ongoing gag in their show about all of the characters on their spaceship sitting down and watching Fast and the Furious 5000 together. Um, and so when I was reading your book and I encountered the film, my first thought was like, oh, somehow Star Wars is still going on. So somehow there's like been 9 reboots and it's still happening, and that's the film reel we found. Um, was the meta movie that we've seen only very, very briefly, a riff on Star Wars, or I know you write a lot about video games.
Mm.
Were there nods in the media that they're watching to video games, and did you sneak any references to your favorite video games into the book?
Yes, there is one major reference, which is that the character of Gorb, who speaks in all caps, is named after a similarly insane character who appears in Hollow Knight. It's just like a secret bonus character who kind of looks like an alien and is there kind of as a joke from the developers, and it's like a total tone shift from the rest of the game. Because Hollow Knight is obviously very sad and melancholy. You just meet Gorb, who's loving life. So yeah, that was the one. That was kind of the direct video game influence in the Friends from Beyond universe. And yeah, obviously thinking a lot about like vintage Star Trek in the kind of sweaty
Yes.
beating someone up on kind of like a rubber set thing. Weird home, like not weird, but like very intense homoeroticism, cheap sets, big dialogue, big feelings.
Hmm.
And yeah, you definitely thinking a lot about that wonderful age of like like when science fiction was extremely sincere and also extremely optimistic about what the future would look
Yeah.
like. Which I find that's almost part of the melancholy is like, here they are, here they all are sitting in this in the future, knowing that that future did not come to pass, that people were dreaming about in the past. So even in this setting that's very silly, again, there's that sort of melancholy sense running through everything, which I feel a lot when I look at like science fiction from 50, 60 years ago, when people kind of thought that things were just going to get better and better and better and nothing was ever
Hmm.
going to change. Uh, and also just for the reader, I think I'm aware this is a dense novel. It's got a pretty big cast. For me, it just felt super important to take regular breaks, as the old saying goes, and just reestablish where everyone is, where everyone's at, and give kind of the story a chance to breathe, and the reader too, hopefully. So yeah, it was kind of again like building a little bit of the emotional texture of the story, but while also having nothing really important happen for a couple of pages, so people can relax.
Well, it's you call it dense, and I don't know if that's true. I think it's meaty, but like a well-cooked
Sure,
meat, like it's not hard to chew through.
yeah, it's tightly packed, should we say?
Yes. Yeah, and I honestly I my beef with filler in books is that like when you're not trusting the reader and you're over explaining things. But if we've learned anything from say like the original Avatar the Last Airbender and then the terrible Netflix adaptation, it's that like you actually need those moments of like character levity where it feels like there's nothing happening, but in fact what's happening is like character connection and these little moments both between each other and with the reader that keep you motivated and invested.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great opportunity for me to have like characters who otherwise would not get to talk to each other and see how they interact. Again, it's just like it's fun for me, like in my little lab, getting to see Rogan and Kipple have an interaction, being like, wow, that's those two don't get on at all. That's hilarious. And who's putting their feet up on the seats, who's making a mess. Um, yeah, it's sweet. And for me, just as an exercise as a writer, it sort of helps me reestablish who these people are and how much they mean to each other, which again is important to have in your mind going forward.
Yeah, and I think also for specifically for a book like Floating Hotel, where it is not only an ensemble cast, but an ensemble cast in a workplace environment, you need those moments because those moments establish the history between characters. Like I loved seeing who was snipping at who, and it's like, oh, I know. It's like you've interacted for 3 seconds, and I do already agree with who I think is right historically, though I've known you both for 2 pages.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But maybe you know them from their own stories, so you're like, oh, of course,
Yes.
you would say
Mhm.
that. You like, yeah.
Yeah. It's like
It's
it's
all
like
part of the fun.
I think honestly, I think this book has a lot of rereadability factor for that reason. Going back and seeing all the interactions from the beginning after you hopped into all of their heads is very different than when you're going through it the first time.
Well, I hope that's part of the pleasure of it, really, is like getting to a certain character and being like, oh, yeah, I wondered what was going on with her. And then, finding out maybe it's not exactly what you expected or, viewing things in a different light. For me, as someone who's kind of just like nosy, nosiness is in my DNA, that sort of vicarious pleasure of seeing people both from the outside and the inside,
Mhm.
is a big part of the appeal of these kind of stories.
I want to know things.
Yeah. Want to know
I
what's going on.
want to know what's happening with everybody. You tell me. Um, I have a few more official questions on my sheet for you, though I will probably derail on not official questions on my sheet. But if anybody who's in our little audience has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or in that little Q&A box. And when I'm done interrogating Grace about all the things I want to ask Grace about, I'll ask your questions if you have any. Um, I am really curious about because you mentioned you're working on a fantasy. Very intrigued by that. What other sci-fi fantasy have you read lately or watched lately or played lately, and really enjoyed?
Ooh, whatever. Well, I read last year, late to the party on this one. I know it's been huge for years, but I finally read the fifth season trilogy by Anki Jemison
Yeah,
and was just totally gobsmacked by it. Like really, it's not very often I have that experience of like because I like fantasy. I think there is a tendency to become this idea that there is kind of a recipe for what makes a fantasy novel, and we have to follow that recipe. Some people do it very well, but it's when I encounter something like Fifth Season or like Piranesi, that totally flips the
yeah,
script on what fantasy even
yes,
can be.
yep.
I find that so refreshing and inspiring. And so yeah, Fifth Season in particular was a book where I was like, oh my God, the ceiling of what this genre can do is like we haven't even begun to write fantasy. Was my feeling at the end of that. I'm contractually obliged to talk about it every day, or else a bomb planted in my neck will explode. The Bridge by Ian Banks. I read The Bridge. I love The Bridge. I want to talk about The Bridge with everyone. It's a book, again, if you liked Piranesi, it is a surrealist kind of fantasy, kind of literary novel about a man who wakes up on a gigantic bridge and a society that has built itself around this bridge, and no one knows what lies at either end of it, and they're all just carrying on with their lives in this steampunky, stratified society. And I think everyone should read that book. I think it's an absolute lost classic. Yeah. Oh, and the Magic of the Lost. I read The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke over the summer as well, and that was another just like if you want a book that'll just like grip you, but also has sort of meaningful, meaty things to say. I would recommend that very strongly as well.
I definitely need to read. It's The Bridge.
Mhm.
I
The
definitely need
Bridge.
to read that now because I read Piranesi, and it wins, I think, for maybe weirdest book I've ever read.
Really? You've never read
Just
a weirder book?
no, I think
You need to
just
read weirder.
I do need to read weirder. I think just in terms of how the opening chapters are structured,
Hmm.
where conceptually I've read weirder books, but how you're dropped in right away really was just like, you're gonna know right away whether or not you vibe with this book.
I mean, speaking of having trust in your reader, that is a fantastic
Yeah.
example of that, of her just being like, trust me, trust me. And it probably
It,
wouldn't work if it wasn't such a tight little read. Like I read Piranesi in
yes.
a day, and I was like, I can find out what's going on by this evening, and I'm sticking around for it.
Yes.
So yeah, beautiful
It
book.
has it has that same energy that I think a lot of good mysteries do. And as a mystery aficionado, you
Hmm.
can maybe agree with this, where it's like somebody's handed you a really tightly folded piece of paper and it just says one word on top, and you're like, I can unfold all of this.
Hmm.
It won't take me that long to carefully undo this piece of
I mean, one
origami.
of the one of the many things I love about the bridge. Oh my God, I talk about it so much. It's like initially you're a couple chapters in, you're like, I think I can guess what the twist is going to be, and then it turns around, it's like, oh, by the way, here's the twist. I know you figured it out by now. Of course you have. And then it's sort of it kind of gives you that emotional. It sort of it doesn't rely on that twist to make you feel things. It's like, okay, so now we know exactly what's going on a larger sense and on a small, and it's like, even though we know on a higher level what is happening on this bridge, the minutia still matters, and we're still going to play out the day-to-day lives of these people. And yeah, again, I don't want to give away the whole book, but just read it. It's so good. And read
I'm
the
gonna
fifth
go put
season,
it on
everyone.
hold at my library. I
Yeah.
got you. And I think that is something that, like, when we think, if we're gonna referencing something that's now almost like a decade. I feel like it's a decade old in its
Mhm.
failures, but why Game of Thrones failed its ending because it kept trying to circumvent the big plot twists. If you figure out the big plot twist, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's not why readers are along for the ride. They're along for the small moments.
Yes,
And if you can
exactly.
pull those off successfully.
We were
And
chatting shit about Stephen Moffat before this thing began
we
officially, and I think
were.
he is definitely guilty of that. He's guilty of wanting to have like a single mind-blowing revelation, whereas in fact that's not what good stories are, I think. And if your book can be spoiled with a single sentence, like it was not that good to begin, it was not that fresh to begin with, would be my take.
No, and if no reader could figure out what was coming or a viewer, that just means you didn't lay the groundwork well.
hmm Though, funnily enough, I don't think I've encountered anyone who guessed who the lamplighter was yet, which is funny to me because I think it's quite obvious, but my editor tells me that I should it's not. So
Well, you knew from the beginning, so it's always going to feel obvious to you.
exactly that I'm like, oh, people are gonna guess it's so obvious. And she was like, no, Grace, it's not.
I didn't guess it, but I think by the time I would have started guessing, I was already just like, I'm along for the ride. I'm not going to think
It's
about
just
that.
like,
You'll
yeah.
tell me when you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
Whitney in the comments wants to know how the cover was chosen.
Oh, good question. Well, it's the same cover in the UK and the US. So that cover it was kind of a collaboration. I have an annual tradition, a very, very good friend of mine, Flint, who's sort of a writer and an artist. We have an annual tradition of like renting a cottage together every year and going away and like working on our projects together. And so last year we were staying together at a cottage in Cornwall, and I was saying like, oh, I have to give a brief for the cover. I don't know what to say because I had no like actual image of the hotel in my head. So I just started describing different elements to him, and he was just like with his iPad, like, so kind of like this. And I was like, what the fuck? So he sent me that sort of rough sketch, and then it was sent off to Alyssa Winans, who also did the UK cover for Frontier, which is very beautiful. And yeah, that's what she produced. And I was just like, that's great. I would confess, Hard Escape, Hard and Stout make really, really beautiful covers. It's something they're kind of known for. So I usually, with a few exceptions, I generally don't interfere because I think that that is left to the artists and the marketers, and they know what they're doing with that
That's
stuff. So
that's what they're paid for.
exactly,
I do.
exactly.
I will say I love how shaped the hotel is.
Mm,
I love that it is not just a circle or a spit. It is that creature is shaped.
yeah,
Um, if you probably can't see it on my screen, folks at home, so look up the cover, or even better, buy a copy, and then you can admire it in person in your own
you
hands.
should do that. You should pre-order it from Oblong Books, perhaps. I hear that they're a wonderful vendor of literature.
Oh, we have a big stack that are ready to ship out to you right now. Um, we are starting to approach the end of our time, and I know it is almost midnight where you are. So lest we drag you into the morrow, I'm going to start to wrap up here. My last question for you is there anything you want to tell us about Floating Hotel or what you're working on that you didn't have a chance to talk about while we were chit-chatting?
Nothing to say about Floating Hotel. Enjoy it. Have fun.
Buy it.
Um, please buy it. Please pre-order it from an indie bookshop if you can. If you love it, that's wonderful. If you hate it, keep it to yourself. That's okay too. Yeah, and as for my next book, I can't give away too much information except to say that it's very, very different. It's pretty ambitious. And hopefully I will ha keep your eyes peeled because we'll have more news about that soon. Hopefully.
Amazing.
Touch wood.
Grace, where can people find you on the internet if they want to keep up with all the things you're working on?
I'm on Instagram at Grace Curtis Posts. I think that's probably the best place. And you can follow me on Twitter for as long as it still stands. I think it's Gracie Your Rights. But if you just type in Grace Curtis, I should come up. Oh
Do
yeah,
you
loves it
have
comes with a playlist. Yeah.
a website or a newsletter?
No, I have a link tree.
I'll email you my lecture about why authors should have newsletters. You should get a newsletter.
Oh, I
Um,
I don't have time.
you
I'd
don't have
love
to
to,
send
but
it out. It's just
hmm?
so you have the emails, because one day all of social
Okay.
media will collapse.
Oh, the RSS feed. That's a smart point. Yeah.
Um, and until Grace gets a newsletter, you can follow her on social media. And if you want a copy of Floating Hotel, you can order it now at oblongbooks.com. We will ship it out to you tomorrow because we're closed right now, but we'll ship it out to you ASAP. We ship almost anywhere in the world, unfortunately, except the UK right now, but you can just buy it from one of your indies there if you're in the UK. Um, and if you live in the Rhinebeck area, come walk into the bookstore and chat with me about it and have a grand old time. Grace, it was such a delight to have you on.
Thank you so much for
Thank
having me.
you
I
for
really appreciate it. This was lovely.
Yay, thank you for staying up, I assume, past your bedtime to talk to me.
Yeah. We're coming up close. But yeah, sorry about my sleepy ramblings. Hope I
They were
made
perfect.
sense.
And for those of you who want to rewatch the event, it'll be on YouTube later. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a wonderful night. Grace, go get some sleep. And we will see you online again soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.